Humankind is produced in association with WGBH Boston and supported by the Humankind Program Fund and a special grant from the Henry Luce Foundation.
I sort of feel as though the real party started when I started doing this, because I stopped having to hide and I got to find out what it was to be true to myself.
How Alcoholics Anonymous has helped people stay sober and begin their search for underlying causes of addiction. You're listening to Humankind. I'm David Freudberg. A recent survey found more than 100,000 Alcoholics Anonymous groups worldwide. Millions of people battling the bottle have found help through this quiet organization, which is free of charge and open to anyone. And the power of AA meetings, where members find the courage to open up to each other, derives from a basic respect. Everyone has suffered, everyone has made wrong turns, and everyone possesses remarkable inner strengths to be uncovered. Here's Mike, a 27-year-old who works in the software industry.
It certainly was I guess you could say, a tumultuous early childhood. My parents had me when they were young. My earliest memories were ones of, kind of instability, uncertainty, mistrust. And I think, to a certain extent that shaped kind of the way I saw the world, as I grew older.
Mike was born in the former Soviet Union and moved as a child to the United States. In the early years, his family traveled around a lot. They were learning a new language, trying to assimilate. He has now lived many years in the Boston area.
I always felt I had something to prove. Again, for whatever reason internally, I had this thing that, I can't feel, on equal footing with people. I either feel less than, or I have to feel twice as good as you. My sneakers have to be twice as expensive and that sort of thing. And I think largely it had to do with, with ego and a lack of humility. And I don't know, it's this chicken or the egg. I think there are certain things within me that existed long before, addiction came into my life. And one of the characteristics was this inability to be satiated, and really the other one was inability to delay instant gratification, even when it's in my own best interest.
It's not hard to fall into this trap, especially in a society where patience and calm reflection are seldom encouraged, while seductive advertising glamorizes immediate pleasure and satisfaction. But addictive behavior is complex, related both to a person's internal psychological makeup and the social influences around them. People get into trouble with alcohol and other drugs for different reasons and in many ways. Here's the story of an educator who grew up in the Boston area. Half a life ago, at age 30, she got sober in AA. We'll call her Lauren.
I think when I was really little, I was pretty happy. But after a fairly short while, I started having a sense that something was wrong. I later discovered that there were problems in the family that nobody talked about because partly of the time when all of this was happening and partly because of the culture of my family. But, for a little kid, if something's wrong, it can't possibly be people like your parents because you need them. So it pretty quickly turns to the assumption that it's you. So I, thinking way back, don't remember much of my life when I was little where I didn't think something was wrong with me. So a lot of that feeling led to both fear, being frightened that somehow if people really knew who I was, they wouldn't want to be around me because there was this wrong thing about me. And so I sought all kinds of ways to hide. And I hid in books. I, pretty young, started hiding in food. I hid in taking things, as though somehow there would be some way of easing this feeling.
From an early age, I'm 0 to smitten in 3.2 seconds with everything. It was, pedal to the metal with anything I do. I picked up the piano at 5. I haven't put it down. I picked up a skateboard, still do that. Guitar, I picked up substances, and you almost have to pry it out of my cold dead fingers. I just stick with things. But I was very adept at living a double life. So through college, full blown addiction, was already there. And this was the explosion of OxyContin and Percocets, which I was always recreational with, but then it stepped up, in college, and a lot of my friends who ultimately got swept up with it as well, and it hit the middle class much harder, than the previous, the heroines, and it, the tragedy of it all was it was ultimately a bridge to, the heroin and the other things. Addiction for me, it's the same whether I gamble my money away or, promiscuity or drugs, alcohol, all of that ultimately leaves me empty spiritually.
I'm prone to say that my drug of choice is more, and it doesn't really matter what, because I really believe I can become addicted to pretty much anything. I define myself as an alcoholic because although alcohol was by no means the only substance I abused, when I drank to get drunk. And the very first time I drank, I was very clear. I'd had disappointing news about something, and I remember very vividly thinking, oh, well, a good way of responding to that would be to go get drunk. And I'm not sure I'd ever really drunk much of anything before that, but I went home. It was later at night. I was still in college, but it was the summer. And I went home, and I went into my parents' liquor cabinet and drank a little bit of everything. And after that, I was never, ever, ever able to drink gin again because it just was the one taste that lingered. But I just remember sort of staggering upstairs and flopping on the bed and passing out. Now, I don't think most people, the first time they have a drink, do so with the explicit intention of getting as drunk as they can. And I told myself, well, I'll never do that again. Didn't exactly happen that way.
At first, I liked to shoplift. It escalated to doing things that were, ever more desperate. It's difficult for me even now to go into the details of kind of the things I did because by no means am I proud of it today. It was a lot of crime, robbery and violence and that sort of thing. I mean, I've always just felt restless. I've always felt like I should be, somewhere else doing something else at some other time. And the only time I'm happy is the anticipation of, and as soon as I'm there, I need to go somewhere else. And I always needed danger in my life. So I had to stay up at all hours of the night. And when I was in situations either of danger or, heavy intoxication under the influence of whatever it may be, there was a moment, and for a long time when the substances worked, that they gave me, they gave me peace, I wasn't prey to misery or depression, to borrow words from the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. That when it worked, it returned me, or at least gave me the impression of wholeness. I felt okay. I felt comfortable in my own skin. But as quickly as it came, it vanished. And as things progressed, less and less so. So I needed more and more to feel okay.
People turn to intoxicating substances as a way to alter their mood and often to transcend uncomfortable feelings. At its core, the quest to transcend is a profoundly healthy impulse. It can draw people out of isolation and it can inspire deep spiritual realization. But transcendence can also take forms that are quite detrimental. And in recovery from addiction, people learn how to sort through complicated feelings and choose healthy ways to respond. Again, here's Lauren.
An awful lot of people I know who end up alcoholic and addicted to other stuff are incredibly attuned and sensitive to others and don't have very well-developed capacity to screen out what is someone else's stuff and what's ours. And so I know that when someone else was angry or agitated, I just took it all in, and I didn't have very good filters. And so sometimes that just got to be too much. It was like I felt too much. And the only way I could find to cope with that was to sort of buffer it. I worked in a bar for 2 years, and because everybody there drank a lot, and would hang out after work and stay way after hours drinking, my behavior didn't stand out. Alcohol reached a point, and again tied in with things like food, where I realized that I just couldn't stop. It meant that I hid more and more. I found that I felt more and more desperate and more frightened. There was just the constant sense that I have a secret and I can't tell anyone. And it's disgusting and terrible, and it makes me a terrible person. And certainly the sense of it being a moral issue, that I should be able to just stop. And I can remember people I knew saying, well, why don't you just exercise a little more willpower? And I used to just feel so helpless when people would say that.
I kept doing what I was doing, because, again, fear never could do it for me. Consequences never could do it for me. I know the judge in certain towns pretty well, along with the law enforcement officers. The thing is, I've gotten a lot of breaks, both from the legal system, because they saw some potential that I didn't see. But ultimately, even they got fed up with me, and so I was sent away. And then, to the place I went to, actually, in intake, I made a really bad decision, to in effect, bring things in, because they were, to medically detox myself off of the prescription, medications I was on. They saw it as, contraband. So anyway, I was sent to administrative segregation, which is like, I guess, the jail within the jail or what have you. But it's 23 hours lockdown, by yourself, solitary, yeah.
Things just kept going downhill. And I got more and more miserable, and I started trying. I thought, well, maybe if I go to therapy. And the only problem was I never told the therapist what I was really doing, so it made it a little hard for her to actually help me with what was the real problem. I tried acupuncture. I tried hypnosis. I tried every blessed thing to try to stop the combination of eating and drinking and sort of excess, and I just couldn't. There were some things I was really afraid of. There were certain drugs I knew that, looking at the way I smoked cigarettes, at the way I handled drinking, and certain other drugs, there were certain things that I knew if I picked them up, I would be dead, because I don't even know that I had the word addiction in my vocabulary at the time, but I knew that there were some things that when I got caught up in them, I couldn't stop.
In the first 2.5 weeks, I didn't sleep a lick. The medications I was coming off of, it was tough. It was tough. I was falling apart. So, with that lack of sleep, I couldn't eat really, a lot of not happy things, not pleasant. But it does things to my mind, and whether it's, because of the detox, I started to have, what you could call a spiritual type of awakening. I remember just being on the ground, in the cell, and watching the stars and just bawling, You reach that jumping off point, right? That I hear talked about. I just couldn't go down that path, any longer. But I didn't also know how I could make it stop either. Without question, the hardest thing I've had to confront in my life, probably the hardest thing I'll ever have to confront. It is and continues to be my Mount Everest.
We're hearing two members of Alcoholics Anonymous tell the stories of their battle with addiction and valuable life lessons they gained along the way. You're listening to Humankind. I'm David Freudberg. For more information on this segment, please visit humanmedia.org. Again, here's Lauren, a member of AA with long-time sobriety.
I remember an acupuncturist at one point saying to me, well, I've worked with somebody else who has some problems similar to yours, and maybe she'd be willing to talk to you. I said, I was desperate. I said, okay, can you ask her? She gets hold of this woman who says she'll talk to me, so I call her, and she talks to me a bit. And, the first words out of her mouth stunned me because she was saying, oh, yes, I did this and I do this. And I'm like, you don't say that out loud to other people. But it was the first time I had ever heard anybody being just flat out honest about their addictions and their alcoholism. I felt as though a door had opened. I felt as though I could actually breathe. And then she said, I have to go to a meeting. And I thought, well, she must be at work. So she said, but you can call me tomorrow. And she told me the time to call her. And at that point, I was so desperate, I was willing to do anything she said. Had I known how to do handstands, and had she told me to do handstands up the main street, I would have done it. So I called her the next day, and we talked some more, and I told her scraps of what was going on for me. I certainly wasn't ready to start divulging. But I everything she said, I just thought, that's me. And I think that's part of what the 12-step programs do. It's one of the first places I had ever had the experience of people are describing feelings and behaviors, and I know what they mean. And if I tell them what I feel and what I've done, somebody in there has done it too. Anyway, this went on for a couple of days, and then she kept cutting off each conversation by saying that she had to go to a meeting. And I kept thinking, boy, she has to go to a lot of meetings for work. I had no idea. I knew nothing about AA or any other program. So I guess my persistence finally persuaded her that I was halfway serious, because she suggested I meet her at a meeting. I said, okay, and this was at a local hospital. I went there and I walked in. It was a speaker meeting, and somebody was telling their story. And if I had felt I could breathe before, at this point I felt like I am in the right place. I'm just in the right place. Here is where I can tell the truth. And for somebody who had spent so many years hiding and lying, to be in a place where I felt I could tell the truth, it was like crossing a threshold and knowing that if I went back across that threshold, I would always know that that threshold existed. She became my first sponsor, and she was one of those old guard folks who said, you call me every day, you make a commitment that you're not going to pick up, you go to a meeting every day. And I said, yes, ma'am.
In 12-step programs like AA, a sponsor is a fellow member who serves as a mentor, someone to confide in during the awkward moments of withdrawal and the longer-lasting challenges of adjusting to a more emotionally balanced way of life. For almost everyone who's come out the other side, the process is rigorous. Change is earned at the price of self-reflection. For Mike, who we heard from earlier, as for many people in early recovery, the road at times has been bumpy and subject to occasional relapse, although he's put together long stretches of continuous abstinence from alcohol and other drugs.
For me, it had to become a very personal journey. I had to start really getting honest about the causes and conditions. And let's be honest, I knew nothing about it. I could spout off portions of the book that I've memorized, but I needed someone to take me through it. And that's really when the change happened. I at least began in earnest, to surround myself with people on a different wavelength than the people I used to run with. So, 40 days go by, I forget, it's like I fatten up a little bit, I feel a little better, I get moved to the main block, and still I am better. that's it. I'm never going to do this again. Family's coming back in my life and so forth. And I get released not too long after that. I thought, that's it. I've learned, and again, my self-will hijacks, and it starts telling me what to do more than I tell it in sort of some weird sense. I know self-will is my will, but it starts calling the shows. It's like caging a 300-pound gorilla, And then, it starts looking at you with those loving eyes, and saying, come on, I won't stampede around and destroy your house again. Just let me out. I remember last, and so you get convinced by it, My will is like that, both good and bad. But I get out, so I've read it, and I know it, and I know the conditions of the disease. I know that, and the day I get out, it dawns on me that I should call, a person I used to associate with, just to see how they're doing. But really, they also, they sold drugs, let's be honest. And I was lying to myself, which is always where it began for me. I've been lying to myself for a long, long time. So, needless to say, that day I was right back where I was, saying, what just happened, almost in a blink of an eye. It needed to happen because, I remember it being a snowstorm that day as well. I'd gotten out of the courthouse, out of the jail, and I had my stuff and shorts on. It was snowing. It was like February. I was supposed to run to my grandma's house, which was like down the street from where I was released, and I somehow made it there within 2 hours, and I was already high, again.
That first year, it was sort of like being an adolescent and getting hit with all these new feelings, and I didn't even know what they were. That doesn't mean that I was a recovered person overnight, because I had, at that point, up until then, my whole life had been involved in highly addictive behavior, and that included relational sort of addictions, and boy, if it was the wrong kind of guy, I went right for him. If he was unavailable, even more so. It was sort of like going for the impossible, and having no sense that I should have been hearing Danger Will Robinson when I felt certain kinds of attraction on many fronts. So, it was sort of all things that signaled danger. I didn't know how to recognize it. It took a while. And I think going back to the idea that the 12 Steps and 12 Traditions talks about instincts out of balance, I think for me, the process of sobriety has been learning what balance looks and feels like. If I have a little red flag go up, or a little uh-oh feeling, I now know that that's probably something I should pay attention to.
A therapist is helping me unravel, some of the core issues. I know that in looking at, and beginning to sit down and look at my life and what fueled it, it became painfully clear that at the core of my problem, drugs aside, if they didn't even exist in this perfect universe, I was a selfish, self-centered, conceited, distrustful person, and it wasn't a pleasant thing to see. And all of those things were unified by one. I was afraid, I was always afraid. It goes back to my childhood, I feared that I wasn't going to get enough. I feared that you're going to take it away from me. I feared that, I'm not going to be okay. Fear-driven existence.
To see oneself more clearly, to get down to root causes, to understand what's driving self-destructive behaviors, the Alcoholics Anonymous program offers tools for looking inside. An essential resource is attending the free AA support groups located in virtually every city and town. Members also benefit from carving out quiet time for contemplation.
I do consider this a spiritual practice. And I think the reason it's called practice is because you have to practice it. I just sort of feel that there's something I speak to. I still ask to keep true. I use things like the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. And at the beginning of every meeting, if there's a period of silence, I will sort of ruminate on each word of that.
A fundamental principle of AA is connection. Partly that's making contact with one's own higher power or inner compass, and partly it's forming a bond with others in recovery. People caught up in addictive behavior are almost always emotionally isolated and sometimes socially isolated. The AA fellowship helps them break out of isolation and find acceptance in a compassionate community of people who directly understand the struggle for sobriety.
A sponsor is someone who's been sober longer than the person they're sponsoring and whose only responsibility is to share their experience and whatever strengths they've developed and to try to transmit hope. So if somebody comes into the program and they're new and they're frightened all the time, I can say, I know what that's like, and here's what it felt like for me. And I can also tell you that if you keep doing the work, it will go away.
I've derived the most happiness in my life. I felt the best when I've given something to others without expecting anything in return. My grandpa recently passed away, and, I spent one day a week with my grandma, and we talk. She tells me stories that she never even bothered to tell me, which is a great thing. And that's just really a small example. It's hard to kind of express. I see a woman struggling with groceries, an older one. I'll help her. I just wherever it is. It's late at night and I'm tired. I see a tiger commercial on TV. I adopted a tiger. Just little things. Helped me more than anything else, what I've sought. And not only that, I think it's contributed to ensuring against, going back to who I was, because it's very simple arithmetic. If I was a selfish, self-centered person, then selflessness and giving is the antidote for that. That's what neutralizes my volatile nature, and I think it's, Notre Dame has, a saying, in Paris on the cathedral. I think it's translated something like, and I always liked it. And now it actually kind of makes sense to me. I sought my God I could not see. I sought my soul eluded me. I sought my brother, and I found all three. That means something to me today. It really, really does.
Mike, and before him Lauren, members of Alcoholics Anonymous. You're listening to Humankind. I'm David Freudberg. Studio recording by Antonio Oliart Rose. Editorial assistance from Thomas Royal and Kathy Graham. Webmaster Brian K. Johnson. Special thanks to Tony Buck. Our program is presented by Human Media in association with Connie Goldman Productions. Program development provided by Shart Media.
You can hear more episodes of our series at humankindpodcast.org. That's humankindpodcast.org.
This segment, Breaking the Cycle, is Humankind Program number 197. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving us a review at Apple Podcasts or another podcast service. It goes a long way in helping people find the Humankind series. And you can follow us on Instagram or Facebook, or check out our YouTube channel for full episodes of the podcast. Again, the title is Humankind on Public Radio. Finally, if you'd like to support this podcast, please go to humankindpodcast.org and choose how you can help at the top of our homepage. That's humankindpodcast.org. Thanks.